Welcome to today's conversation. Today we're going to be talking with Tschiesche. Jenny is a nutritionist, she's a presenter, and she's written 4 books about nutrition. She works with sports people and people who suffer from illness also. So today we are going to be discussing the effects that grief has on the body and how we can best look after our bodies, or even get other people to help us to look after our bodies during a really difficult time when our body requires nutrition the most. But yet it's a time when we're not really focusing on our nutrition. In fact, quite often we can go against food and our throats might close down, and there's many problems around food and grief. Some people gain weight, some people lose a lot of weight. But together, Jenny and I, we discuss all of these kind of things. Jenny and I first met when I had created my Grace handbag, which is a handbag that is designed to help women to eat better, feel better, and live better. And we were going to get together and work out how we can help and inspire women to take greater care of themselves and get work-life balance. When I lost my son Murray last July, that took Jenny and I on a completely different journey. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Jenny Tschiesche. Good morning. It's really great that you're joining me on this. I remember the first time we met. And I left you saying, "Oh, my new best friend," and we've got on really well ever since. And I know that you've got loads and loads of knowledge that you can share with people who are listening to this broadcast, who are either suffering themselves with grief, or they are somebody who's got a loved one or a friend who is in that grieving process, of which it's important for both of those kind of sets of people to kind of listen to your thoughts on how best to deal with what we eat during that time. And when my son passed away, I basically just craved it. First of all, it had to be something quick to eat. I didn't really want to eat, but I did crave carbohydrates. And I know you're going to explain why I might have craved carbohydrates at that time. And I did have lots of people, which I'm very grateful for bringing food to me. Because I think if they didn't, I possibly wouldn't have eaten, or I would have eaten even more carbohydrates. So what are your thoughts on that? That in this time of grief, what kind of things might be happening to our systems, for instance?
Yes, it's an interesting time because people's reactions and their bodily responses are unpredictable to a degree. Some people will feel sort of more hungry in the sense that they will probably sort of feel emotional hunger and therefore they will comfort eat. Whilst other people can go as far as becoming malnourished due to a lack of nourishment, a lack of food, and certainly the right kind of food at this time. And, there are some very physiological reasons why that happens. So actually, when the body is going through grief, there is a change in the chemistry within the body. And it's that change within the chemistry that can cause you to do several things, really, but certainly craving carbohydrates, which, even sort of outside of grief are comforting. They're the sorts of foods, if we go back to our sort of Paleolithic days, our caveman days, we sought out the sorts of foods that were going to give us that quick, nutritious as we could find in those days. And of course, the food landscape has changed humongously in the intervening period with processed food and factory-made food, etc. But back then, food was sparse, and we would be looking for something that was going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, sort of thing. We'd be finding the food that was fattiest and sweetest and as nutritious as we could get. But it was interspersed with periods without. And I think when we go through the period of grief, we are seeking out those things, but probably on a more regular basis. Or, as I say, the other thing that can happen is that everything sort of slows down and actually we just can't eat. And it can go quite far, actually. I mentioned malnourishment, but people can have sort of physical problems with swallowing. We've got dysphagia, where you can't actually swallow food because there's almost like this association with this physical process and sort of some sort of pleasure. We don't deserve pleasure right now, so we shan't be eating, we shan't be enjoying food. So it can kind of go different ways, and I don't think who you are outside of grief is a predictor of how your body is going to react and respond during grief. But certainly it can have a really big and not to be underestimated effect on your eating behaviors and your eating patterns.
Yeah, when you were saying there about punishment, as in not eating, at the time when I was eating this rubbish, and I'm talking a lot of rubbish, sometimes 2 packets of biscuits per day. Um, and at the time, I remember thinking, I, I am punishing myself in some way because I know the effects of that on my body, but I didn't care. So I didn't care about myself. And I think I did actually want to punish myself, punishing myself by putting on weight because I didn't feel worthy. There's all kinds of psychological things going on as well. And maybe we can talk more about that actually, the psychological effects of what you eat and why you might eat that. Why would I want to punish myself during that time and choose food in order to do that?
Yeah, so from the perspective of the kind of the guilt and the punishment elements, I think it's very easy to place the emotions that we perceive we should be experiencing at that time as a kind of a reason for why we are behaving as we are. But I don't think we should forget that we do change during grief. And I think people, as I say, sort of had underestimated what's going on inside the body. We know, for example, that when there's been examples of research that's done where people have had, fat injected into their bodies without the associated food. And then we've looked at what the response and reaction of those people is to something really sad or, sad images. And actually they feel much less of an extreme reaction response to sad imagery with fat inside their body. So we know that the body wants to eat fat. We also know that sugar and fat can blunt the stress response, can calm the stress response down. So we shouldn't underestimate the fact that we are going to naturally be feeling a certain way, but it's very easy for the body then and the mind, I think, to override that and think, well, I'm just eating this, so I'm just going to carry on this way. But I think if we understand the mechanisms that are at play, and I mean, who's got a lot of time for thinking about this or even the desire to want to think about this? But if it can be any help to have it explained that, you shouldn't be wanting to sabotage your body because actually it's your body sort of sabotaging you. So then don't add to that with the, I feel terrible because, and it happens. We do it. It's natural. We think, well, I've done this, so I'll just carry on doing this and that's all I deserve. But what I'm saying is your body's naturally wanting to eat fatty foods. It's naturally wanting sugary foods. Then if we cannot add to that by then feeling terrible about the fact we're doing that, kind of almost allow this process of grieving. And it isn't going to be the best. You're never going to have the best diet during this process. You're not. You simply are not. But understanding that there's a reason why you're experiencing what you're experiencing, why you're going through that, is so important to try and weather this storm as kind of damaged as possible. Allow this to happen to your body. It is going to happen. We are going to change, but I don't think people necessarily recognize it as a physiological thing. They think it's all to do with what's going on in the brain.
Yes, that explains such a lot, Jenny, and makes me feel so much better. Also, I mean, it's coming up for 10 months since I lost Murray, and now I feel like I'm piecing myself back together, so possibly in a position where I can take a little bit more control over that. which is, which is good, because I didn't think I was actually going to get here. And I'm sure for people who are in those early stages of grief, you just don't know what is going on, really. And so it is nice to know that in time you'll come back. We were talking, I think last week, weren't we? And we were talking about how we can end up creating habits that aren't going to serve us, which it's like the chicken and egg scenario, really. Which comes first? Is it your diet, or is it like your psychological, emotional aspect of grief? Or how can you work these side by side? How can we, help those two to progress? Like with what we might be able to eat, that's going to satisfy the fat and sugar and also help us nutritionally. What can be done there?
It's a tough one. I know when we talked last week, prior to this interview, we were just actually discussing your own situation, and I know you said that people had brought food for you to eat, and it was almost this sort of childhood habit, I think you said, of being told you eat what you, if somebody makes something, you eat it, and that's, someone's given you this gift and you eat it. And actually that's a survival mechanism potentially, but it certainly, meant that you did eat, and thank goodness to those people who brought you things. And we can, talk about that actually, if people want to help, what sort of things they could be bringing, because it's very easy to, bring the cakes and the sweets and the things that you think are going to provide that instant comfort, and certainly they will, but there would be better things to think about as well. We also talked about what happened with, some of the new habits that were forming for you, and then the outcomes. And actually, I remember we talked about the immune system. And I think you hadn't made the connection that you had been poorly, because I guess, again, when you're going through such a desperate time, what's a cold? What is a cold in that period? It's nothing. But we do know that, again, from a physiological perspective, things change, and the change in the production of specific hormones leads to a lower white blood cell count, which actually means that we lower our immunity when we go through grief. And you are much more prone to colds, to coughs, and to flus. So, we're recording this during lockdown, during a period when people might be quite concerned about their immune system. And, what might happen is that people start to make, again, that connection between immunity and illness and grief. And I think when you start to think about that, when we start to get very physical symptoms of lowered immunity, we start to get poorly. That is one of the times that people might start to think, oh gosh, right, maybe I do need to check in with what I've been eating. Maybe now's the time to think about improving, the amount of zinc and the amount of vitamin C and vitamin A, etc., that I have in my diet, because of course those are the things that are going to help boost our immunity. So it may be that it takes something to happen to us for us to have that wake up call where we think, right, okay, so now's where I need to be, maybe tweaking a little bit. Maybe I've let things get a little bit too biscuit, cakes, bread, etc., and not enough vegetables, fruit, nuts, seeds, and those sort of things. It's tough, right? It's a really difficult period when you really aren't thinking about you, and the habits that you do form, unfortunately, do tend to dictate how your body reacts and responds further down the line. And it is about somewhere along the line trying to find, and it's not going to be an overnight solution, but some point at which you can sort of start to arrest things, start to slow things down, or start to address things for the betterment of your health, both physical and mental.
Yes, and it comes in time, because I remember the very early days. You can't think from one minute to the next, so you do actually require people to be bringing you some food. Now, just then you spoke about some specific hormones that are changed during grief. What hormones are we talking about there, and what can we do?
We're talking about your stress hormones, basically, and your stress hormones, so adrenaline and cortisol. I mean, cortisol particularly can be quite damaging we're going to produce it anyway in normal amounts. In fact, we start the day, most of us, with we call it the circadian rhythm, but it's the rhythm to which the body works, naturally. And it starts at a higher level at the start of the day, and it slowly gets lower throughout the day. And that's its natural course and its natural pattern. And it's meant to do that because towards the end of the day, we're supposed to be slowing down, we're supposed to be calming down, we're supposed to be getting ready for the night time when we'll go to bed and hopefully sleep well. But as we know, that's not going to happen. So sleep cycles are disrupted. And again, that could be a chicken or egg situation. Circadian rhythm is very much affected because people's cortisol levels will be changing as a result of experiencing grief. And cortisol is very much linked to this circadian rhythm. So you will find your circadian rhythm will change. And with that also will change the amount of sleep that you're able to get. And with that will change the production of ghrelin and leptin. So ghrelin is your hunger hormone, and leptin is that I'm satisfied by the food I've eaten hormone. So you produce sufficient amounts of leptin when you've eaten the right kind of foods in the right quantities. You produce ghrelin when your body needs to be able to eat to fulfill, again, that nutritional hunger, that nutritional need. But what happens when we lack sleep is that we produce too much ghrelin and we don't produce enough leptin. So we feel more hungry generally than we would normally, and we're certainly not satisfied by the food that we're eating, which is why so many of us end up going through a sort of comfort eating period, and we suffer with grief.
But on the opposite scale of that is, you do get times when you just lose tons of weight. I mean, a few years ago, I went through a grief period. It was actually a breakup of a relationship. And I lost over 1.5 stone in weight. I looked like a skeleton, and it was really quite ugly, actually. I look back at photographs, I look about 90. And when I lost Murray, I just thought, oh no, I'm heading for that again. But I did the opposite. So now I'm the same person, I suppose, two different intensities of grief, but the same person, but yet two completely opposite reactions to a loss. That confused me, really. The only way that I could look at that was, well, maybe one situation I felt I could change, but this one I can't change. So maybe I just surrendered to it. And I don't know. I don't really understand that.
It's an interesting one. Remember at the very start of this interview, I said you can't look at you outside of grief and predict how you're going to react and respond during grief. And I think the same in episodes of grief. We just don't know how the body's going to react and respond in different episodes, different ways. One thing that when we talked prior to this interview, said that had happened when you lost Murray was that people came and brought you food and helped with that. And I think perhaps there was comfort in that connection. We do form very deep-rooted connections with food, particularly in relation to how our upbringing was, and things that sort of sitting down to certain flavors or textures in a nice or happy environment as a child would certainly bring us comfort, when we were going through more difficult times. I don't know what the situation was with the prior incidents of grief, but whether people were bringing food, whether people were providing that comfort, or whether you had to try and find the effort and energy to instigate that yourself, which could stand in the way as a barrier. But like I say, people can become malnourished with grief. They can stop wanting to eat entirely. And that's almost the body just sort of switching off. The stress has distracted the body from digesting. And we always say that one of the reasons that we get so many problems with things like irritable bowel syndrome, and actually even more so, we're now getting inflammatory bowel problems such as Crohn's to a greater degree, far greater numbers, is because people have so much more stress in their lives on such a continual basis, and it can start to affect the health of the gut, and your body stops being able to digest and also take out the nutrients from the food that you're eating. So you're not even getting as much nutrition as the food you're eating would suggest you could be, because you're not able to absorb as much. And that over the course of time can lead to all sorts of health and gut-based issues. And of course the gut seat of the emotions, but also it is very much part of our overall health and well-being. So if the gut isn't operating as well, then certainly that's something that we need to be thinking about in relation to, how much we even want to eat, and how much less perhaps we might want to eat if things that make us feel quite poorly when we do eat them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So as our body is releasing more of this cortisol, the adrenaline and the cortisol, how is that affecting our stomach and that gut fauna that, we're now learning is really important to our health and our happiness in a way? I know in the grief period, it's very difficult to even strive for happiness. I think at the early stages, you strive for survival. But there does come a time when, you're looking at how I can improve my level of happiness. So what's happened to the gut during those bad times? And even like you just said, even though you're putting food in, your gut isn't necessarily able to take the nutrition from the food that you're putting in, let alone when you put in 2 packets of biscuits a day, which has very little nutrition anyway. So what is actually happening in the gut area at that time?
So first of all, the gut is a fine balance of good bacteria, essentially. We call it our microbiome, and it's very much part of our immune system. But it's also really important to note that 95% of our serotonin is produced in the gut. So that gives us some indication. Serotonin, of course, is a precursor to melatonin, which is our sleep hormone, which we should also note. So during the process of grief, a lot is changing within the body. But one of the things that can happen, which is only exacerbated by poor food choices, is that the gut can become imbalanced. So there can become an imbalance of bacteria. The bacteria that reside within the gut can reside in very healthy populations. But when we start giving the body and the gut food such as sugary foods and refined carbohydrates, the bad guys, if you like, if there are any bad guys, can overpopulate. But also you can get an overpopulation of even what we consider to be normal things like normal yeasts and normal bacteria within the gut, which can make us feel quite poorly. So fine balance until we unsettle it. So when we start to experience grief and we experience changes in hormones, so stress hormone production, when we start to experience grief and our eating habits change and we're eating more refined, so white carbohydrates, white grain-based foods, sugars, etc., and perhaps relying more on a little bit of alcohol or more than a little bit of alcohol and caffeine, all of these things can actually feed into making that fine balance of bacteria within the gut, that microbiome, much more imbalanced. And when it becomes imbalanced, it can actually start to break down. So it's the lining of the gut, the epithelial cells start to move apart slightly. And that's when we experience something called a leaky gut. And that's where people can start to feel reactions to foods that they've never had a problem with prior. So, the classics, of course, are things like wheat or dairy foods that they may never have had a reaction to before, but now they are reacting to as a result of unsettling the health of the gut due to the combination of change in hormones as a result of grief, but also as a result of eating habits associated.
And what kind of symptoms might you get if you start to have a reaction to those kind of foods? If you've never had them before, you might not associate what's going on with your body as a reaction to, the white flours and sugars and things like that.
What's really interesting about reactions that we perceive to be related, or that are related to the gut, the reaction is not just related to the gut. So most people think that if they're going to have something that's happening inside the digestive tract, that all symptoms are going to be related to that. And certainly some are. You would, for example, expect to experience more wind, more smelly wind, maybe bad breath. You would expect to experience maybe some bloating, some kind of distension in the stomach, and certainly maybe looser stools, or the other way, constipation. So those would be very, obvious things perhaps to think about. But less obvious, people might start getting migraines when they eat certain foods. They might have skin reactions. eczema, for example, is quite a classic one that people think, well, I'm experiencing eczema because I'm going through a period of stress, but actually can very much be related to an imbalance of bacteria in the gut. And possibly once the imbalance of bacteria in the gut has been allowed to take hold, like I say, an overpopulation of bacteria that shouldn't be there, or those that should be there but in greater numbers than they should really be in a healthy microbiome. So they can be experiencing symptoms that are way beyond the gut, like headaches, skin problems, behavioral issues, and people might not associate those with an imbalance in gut bacteria.
And I suppose the behavioral issue, that would make sense if 95% of our serotonin, which is the happy hormone, is produced in our gut, but our gut can't actually take in the right nutrients, it's got the wrong fauna, etc. So that would explain maybe overreactions, maybe the wrong word, but you may during times of grief say the wrong thing, get angry, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that eating properly will take that away, because there's so many more emotions involved in grief, of which I will be discussing with future guests. But we could possibly help ourselves a little bit, or get other people to help us with, maintaining the gut bacteria so that we can produce the serotonin, because the mind isn't doing it. We always think that it's in the brain, don't we? That the mind and how we think, that's going to create this serotonin. And my past work has all been about the mind and how we think and how that can change your world. You can become happier, you can take more control of your life. And I tell you, this level of grief completely threw that off for me. I did try and claw myself back a little bit by changing my thinking, but it was the toughest thing to do. And a lot of the time I just gave into it. But what I was saying right at the beginning, it's the chicken and then the egg, which one do you actually go for? So I possibly wasn't doing myself any favors in the longer term by eating the level of carbs that I was. I mean, maybe some carbs is okay if your body is craving the fat and the sugars in order, at that time, in order to survive. But, maybe we just need to know a little bit more what we can do. What would you say we can do? What kind of foods is a good idea for us to be not craving, because we are going to crave fats and sugars, but, good fats and sugars? What can we do with that?
Yeah, one thing I will say, and I think it's important to recognize, we talked a little bit about, changing in hormones, but this is a really difficult period, and it's a period during which you are going to be putting a lot of strain on the body and the body's ability to manage stress. One thing we should talk about briefly is the effect of adrenal fatigue on the body, and that will help us, I think, understand what we could be doing to improve and what we could be asking those around us to help us do to improve our overall health and well-being during this period. So ad means above and renal means kidney. So these are the little glands that sit above the kidneys, and they are responsible for, again, this cortisol production, stress hormone production. During periods of grief and long periods of stress, we ask a lot of these glands. We ask them over and over again to help support us through, what we're going through. And what we do know, actually, and I think one of the things we talked about, a little test that you can do at home, which helps identify whether this is something that you are struggling with, is to put a very physical stressor on the body. And this is something you can do in your bathroom. If you, obviously, your bathroom, so you know where the mirror is and you know where the light is. So the idea is that you go into your bathroom and then you just turn on the light, look in the mirror and look at the reaction of your pupil and see whether it gets small and stays small. That's a really good reaction to stress. But I would predict that it wouldn't do that, that it will start to, pulsate. And in some cases, it will go from very small to very large very quickly. And that is giving you an understanding of the degree to which you may be experiencing this adrenal fatigue. And adrenal fatigue can very easily happen. It can very easily creep up on us, particularly when we're going through grief. The symptoms of it would be that you would feel really tired, even if you had had enough sleep. You feel the need to eat sugary foods and you crave salt, that's another indicator. You feel like you might be getting a second wind in the evenings, but you generally are really tired, and more tired than a lack of sleep could possibly explain. You are lackluster, you just can't be bothered, and it affects your mind and your motivation, as well as your physical energy levels as well. And so that little test is a really good way of finding out whether you are experiencing that, or just gives you a little understanding, an indicator of where you might be in relation to adrenal stress or adrenal fatigue. But certainly when we think about the sorts of foods that are going to help us with every element, then this would be important to consider as part of our recovery from adrenal fatigue as well. So they all kind of fall into the same category, which is that we do need to be thinking about really good quality proteins. And first meal of the day is really important for getting that right. So we do talk about breakfast being, the most important meal of the day. Now, during a period where you are suffering with stress, where you can't even be bothered to eat something, you can't even be bothered necessarily to get out of bed, then asking you to prepare a fiber-rich, protein-rich breakfast may not be feasible, or you may not be capable of doing it. But what I would then say is, if there's just some nuts, if you could get some nuts or some yogurt, just have somebody put something in your fridge, some fruit that you can just grab. And we don't want too much sweetness, we don't want too much sugar, and actually fruit on its own is not ideal either during this period. So we do need to think about a combination of protein, fiber. Those are the most important things to try and get you back on track. And it doesn't have to be breakfast, whatever that first meal of the day is. I've talked about your circadian rhythm being completely shot to pieces, but you may find that where you were somebody that got up, got out of bed and had breakfast immediately, you're no longer that person during this period. You're a person that gets up a bit more slowly now if you get up, and then when you do get up you think, well, I should eat something, fine. But do carry on trying to get through that routine of getting up and having something. Don't rely on the caffeine, don't rely on the sugar, don't rely on the sugary breakfast cereals if possible. Try protein and some fiber first thing in the morning, because it dictates the rest of the day, it sets the tone for the rest of the day, and it tells the body that you are in control, that you're setting up this body for the way it's going to be behaving the rest of the day. And it's just one small thing, one small step that you can make and take to get back on track. That first meal of the day, even if everything else the rest of the day is shot to pieces, go for that first meal and get some protein and fiber in there.
Right. That's it. That's the important one. Jenny, I'm doing these podcast extras and asking my guests to give some extra information for in there. So would we be able to work together and come up with maybe some quick, simple recipes and ideas that we can put together, and they'd be available in the podcast extras? Is that something we could do?
Yeah, we could do some really simple, straightforward combinations of foods that would be grab and go, I think would be the easiest thing. But certainly, yeah, making it easy for people, I think is the ideal.
Yes. And that would be great for people who are helping someone else with their grief, just to be able to bring those things along that are, like you say, grab and go, because you don't know when you're going to eat or what you want to eat. And if there's something just to be able to grab, is really, really helpful. I did get a lot of people brought casseroles and things to me, which is great comfort food. And it's real wholesome. And it did make me, I always think a casserole makes you feel loved. That's what it does to me. I guess that's my childhood, my upbringing. And love is what you really need. That gives you huge nutrition, but nutrition of a different kind. In fact, I would imagine that would affect the gut bacteria also, would it? Because if you're feeling this sense of love.
Yeah, in terms of the way we eat and how we enjoy and engage with food makes a huge difference to how well we are able to absorb nutrients from it. If we are sitting, we tend to be in a much better frame of mind, and sitting in the same place each time to eat. It's a small thing, but it can make a huge difference. If we can eat slowly and mindfully, so we are actually connecting with the food, we are producing more digestive secretions, so more enzymes that help break down food, more stomach acid, because again, what happens generally when we're going through periods of stress is the production of stomach acid declines. So if we can try and tell the body that we're sitting down to enjoy this meal, at the same place or at the same time or at the same time, we are telling the body to enjoy the food. We're telling the body to produce digestive enzymes, and we're telling the body that we really genuinely want to take out of this meal the nutrients that we're putting into our body to nourish ourselves. Very, very important connection between enjoyment of food, feeling, like you say, the love, the connection to maybe the person that's made it for you, and us being able to get the most out of it. So I think, again, that's one of those things that people think of food equals nutrients. There's so much around the environment in which we enjoy the food. There's so much around the way it's presented and the way it looks, and how, we perhaps, if we can, in a social setting, enjoy it with other people in a familiar way, in a comforting way, then certainly we are doing our body a great service.
Yes, yeah. Would you recommend supplements in the early phases of grief? Is that a good idea?
I certainly would. I think it's a period of time when, because you may go to extremes of either comfort eating but not necessarily meeting the nutritional needs of the body, or malnourishing the body by simply not eating enough, then the shortfall can be, and I'm not saying that supplements can make up for a terrible diet, but certainly they can go some way to keeping us on track, because what we do know is that if we are not getting sufficient nutrients, micronutrients and macronutrients, but specifically micronutrients being minerals and vitamins, but also our omega-3 fatty acids and our vitamin D, which of course we predominantly get from the sunshine, our mood will be greatly affected. Our mood is already affected. We don't want to make things worse. So, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, certainly. A probiotic I would look at and think about, and a good quality multivitamin. Those would be my recommendations for this period of time. Asking somebody for help with that is absolutely fine. Asking a professional for help with that, or asking a friend if they can do some research and find out. And you need to make sure that they're really good quality. So when health stores are open, I recommend going and having a chat with an independent health food store, or something like Revital, and they can certainly help you discover which would be the best ones during this period.
Yes, because like you said earlier on, it affects the immune system. So if we're not in a position where we can take care of ourselves, at least taking some multivitamins or something, like you say, it's going to help for when we can, get ourselves back on track and start to take care of ourselves again.
But it's important to go for really good quality supplements. There are many that are available on the market, and the price generally reflects what you're getting. Most things have to be chelated or bound to something for us as humans to be able to take them on board. So, when we think about calcium, for example, you could get calcium carbonate, which of course is chalk. That isn't that easily absorbed into the body. So you are looking to get good quality nutrients into the body, and that does mean we will pay for those, but some more reputable brands, which you would get generally from independent health food stores, then I would recommend those over your sort of mainstream, high street pharmacy type nutrients that you can buy.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, Jenny, but we can maybe do more of that discussion in the podcast extras as well, actually, and give that extra information. I know it's information I would have benefited for. I now have like a mountain of vitamins that I take, but it's taken me a while to come out of that challenging phase. So it would be good to just get that information to people earlier rather than later. So Jenny, thank you very much, and I'll see you over in the podcast extras then.
See you there.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jenny. I really appreciate all your help. See you then. Bye.
Thanks.
Wasn't that a great conversation? I hope you got a lot out of that and have learned many things that you can start to do slightly differently and get a better result and start to take greater care of yourself. I know it is difficult. I'm on that journey myself, but let's not beat ourselves up and just do the best that we can. If you would like more information about Jenny, go to thelunchboxdoctor.com lots of does. So that's lunchboxdoctor.com, and you can find out more information about Jenny there. We are doing more things in the podcast extras. We're continuing the conversation, and we're coming up with some recipes that will help you out and make life easier, those grab and go things that Jenny was just talking about. So to find out about podcast extras, go to thegoodgriefconversation.com. That is thegoodgriefconversation.com, and you'll be able to find out more about the podcast extras over there. I have some more amazing guests coming up in the next few weeks and months, and people who are sharing stories. We're going to be talking about sibling grief and how we can help you, the psychology behind grief, things like that. So there's lots more to come. Thank you for tuning in here on UK Health Radio. It's been my absolute pleasure. I am your host, Janet Jones, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.